Great God, the Creator. Why understanding God as Creator is vital to the Christian life. The United Church of God's fundamental belief says in part, we believe in one God, the Father, eternally existing, who is a spirit, a personal being of supreme intelligence, knowledge, love, justice, power, and authority. He, through Jesus Christ, is the creator of the heavens and the earth and all that is in them. He is the source of life and the one for whom human life exists. Why is this doctrine important? Why is it knowing God as the Creator is important? Now, we might fall into little quibbles talking about this question. It was phraseology, God created all things through Christ, which is biblical phraseology, by the way. We might quibble about the process, or we might just take it as an acknowledged fact. Okay, God's the Creator, so what? Please pass the butter. Or we might speculate about the details of the process or the time frame, most of which, interestingly enough, the Bible is silent about, but we tend to spend our time on it. But more important than a bare fact is the reality behind the fact of God as the Creator, because it impacts in a number of different ways, not just biblically, but it impacts holistically in the sense of philosophy. For example, it impacts on the concept of perfection as conceived by the Greeks. It impacts upon what we now know as the Newtonian realm versus the quantum realm. Because remember, everything, if God created everything, and I put that in quotes, but it's true, it includes space-time. So questions about where God and when God are totally irrelevant because space-time didn't exist. It was just God before the creation. It impacts on doctrine. God as a creator and a sustainer speaks to the final fate of the unrepentant. If you see that the final fate of the unrepentant is life without God, well, I'm sorry, life without God equals non-existence. There's no such thing. The only thing uncreated is God, and the Bible is clear that the Father and Son are uncreated. So it impacts our doctrine upon the relationship of the Son to God. It impacts on theology as well. And that goes beyond doctrine. Theology is sort of the esoteric study of what God is and like and all that sort of thing. For example, God decided to create. He didn't have to. He decided to do that. He speaks. He evaluates. He says things are very good. This means that God is personal, philosophically speaking, or theologically speaking. So we're going to get into some of that today, but I want to spend most of my time on what I consider to be the most important part of this. Acknowledging God as Creator impacts how we live as Christians. It shapes our worldview and thus how we interact with creation and with other people. Now, along the way, I want to leave you with some interesting info so that you can be armed against those who would say that the creation account is not true, or it is derived from other earlier accounts, because we know through archaeology and history that there are other accounts of creation created by other societies that were written down before this one was written down, and it's natural to assume that this one is a copy of those, especially since they share some things in common. But it is not. It's not derived from earlier accounts. It was not imagined by man to explain the things that they could not explain otherwise. So let's get in. Let's start with why the creation account. Why did God give us this? Well, he didn't really give us this. He gave it to a certain group of people. That group of people were the children of Israel who had recently left Egypt. We have all read Genesis 1 and 2, and some of us can probably recount the day-by-day acts of creation from memory. I'm not going to ask you to do that. That's not part of the quiz, just so you know. But have we ever asked, why is this here? Why did God inspire this to be written? What was the message to the tribes of Israel? As I said, they just left Egypt. They were not a people in the sense of that time frame. And all peoples had a god or gods. They wanted identity. They wanted to know if their God was strong enough to see them through. We see echoes of this in Samuel, where the Israelites asked Samuel for a king. Why? They say, give us a king. We want to be like all the other nations. We want to have an identity. We see echoes of it several places in the Old Testament where they say, let's go back to Egypt. At least we knew what we were there. Yeah, we were slaves. They forgot that part, but we at least had some identity there. So the purpose of the account is to show how powerful God is, how he acts, how he acted in the past, and how he will in the future. It's not really a history lesson, not at least as we would call history. It is not a scientific treatise on cosmology or the origins and dates and structures of the universe. Although we will see, it does provide some of that information as well. It is about God, about who he is, his nature, and especially his power. I think I've talked about all of those things. Sorry I didn't get to that slide earlier. That was not in my notes. Let's stop by saying, what do skeptics say about the Bible? What do skeptics say about the Bible? Well, they say it's just a copy. We've gone through that. Genesis is just an observation. And we talk about an idea called God of the gaps. We'll get into that a little bit later. So that's some of the things we're going to cover along the way. But let's get into the pattern of creation. It's an interesting pattern. We begin in Genesis chapter 1. And if you want to turn there now, we're going to spend a fair amount of time there. We start at the very beginning. And as some would say, it's a very good place to start. Verse 1 famously opens with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2 describes the creation with two very important words, which serve as a table of contents, if you will, for the rest of the chapter. And that is, the earth was without form and void. Now, we know in Hebrew those two words are tohu vabohu, which means without form and void in many translations. There are some other interesting translations. Formless is one of them, which is the same as without form, I guess. Without shape is another. And for the second term, void, sometimes it's rendered empty. So it was shapeless and empty. Sometimes it's rendered a desolate emptiness. And interestingly enough, the Message translation gives us a little paraphrase. It says, earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness. So that's kind of an interesting poetic way of saying it. But here's the key. The rest of the account, God will take what is formless and what is empty, and he will give it form, and he will fill it. He will give it form, and he will fill it. That's how creation works. God takes what is formless and empty, and he forms and fills it. We will see that day 1 through 3 are forming days, and days 4 through 6 are filling days. Let's take a look. First of all, how does God form? How does God form? The first stage of the 3 forming days, notice how he does this in 2 steps. He forms things by separating and by naming them. Look at day 1, Genesis 1, verses 3 and 4. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God what? God separated the light from the darkness. He separated it. He separated from the darkness to give form to that which was formless. Formless things have no boundaries. Soup has no shape. God forms things by separating one from another and providing boundaries. Now, we have another word for this, which will be important later on. So this is one of your little Quizlet words, important later on. Another way of saying separating is measuring. God measured it. We see this in Job 38, verses 4 and 5. Job 38, verses 4 and 5. God is talking to Job, and he says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched a line upon it? God again refers to his creative process as one of measuring. Now, let's go back to Genesis 1, verse 5, and look at the second stage of God's formation, naming. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. After separating the light from the darkness, God names them. He names them day and he names them night. Look at day 2, Genesis 1, verses 6 through 7. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. Again, he separates waters from waters. More specifically, he separated what they call the waters from above from the waters below. Now, God is not necessarily talking about actual physical water here, most probably a reference to the forces of chaos. That comes in a little bit later. But he's placing a boundary between things that used to be boundless. He's putting a limit. He's measuring. And guess what? Genesis 1, verse 8, "And God called the expanse heaven." He names it. "And there was evening and there was morning the second day." We go to day 3, Genesis 1, verse 9. "And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so." Again, he sets boundaries. Let them be gathered into one place. And then he names it. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was very good. He limits the waters and names them. He limits the land and names it. So God's act of creation in this case is done through a process of separating and naming. What about us? Is there any parallels you see in our Christian lives with this process? Let's look at 2 Corinthians 6. 2 Corinthians 6, we're going to go through verses 14 through 17. 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 17. The whole passage, this whole part of Scripture that Paul is using here is talking about being separated from sinful attitudes and practices that we find around us. What's that word again? Separated from. Paul says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? And what portion does a believer have with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as Christ said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you." God calls us to be separate from the world around us in important ways. 1 Peter 1, verse 15. "But as he who called you is holy," and holy means separated, by the way, "you also be holy in all your conduct." The word ecclesia that we traditionally translate church was originally a specifically chosen assembly of people, usually for a distinct purpose. So in that sense, they were separate from the rest of the people. Think of the children of Israel. God separated them from Egypt, then named them his people. Again, he separated them and named them. He separates us. He calls us out. And, as we see in Revelation 3, verse 12, "The one who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God." God calls us out, he separates us, and he names us as his children. That is the creation process. Isaiah 43, verses 6 through 7 says this as well. He separates us, he names us, just like in Genesis. And as a result, the converted Christian is a new creation. It's a new creation. Until I was getting into this part of the sermon, I didn't really think about it in those words in that sense. We always think about and talk about a new creation, but it really is. It's a new creation, but it's done just like the old creation. It's the same pattern that repeats itself. It's the same pattern the Creator has used since creation began. So, we are separated. God separated things, he named things, he called things what they gave them a name, gave them a being. And then what? And then what? Well, the second step is he then fills. After he has formed things, God fills things. Here's a little grid that shows you the various scriptures in Genesis to talk about first the forming and then the filling, and then the forming and the filling. So we're going to go through that again really quickly. God said in Genesis 1, verse 3, "Let there be light," and there was light. He called it day, and then darkness. Okay, all that's on the first day. Day 4, what does he do? "And God said, Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God took the day and he filled it, and the night, and he filled it with lights, sun, moon, etc. A couple quick questions for those of you who want to take the little Quizlet thing at the end. Well, who want to add these things to your notes. How has God created all of these things? Mr. Grider referred to it in his sermonette, and we've repeated it several times here. God spoke it, and it happened. God spoke it, and it happened. And so he separates these things, he speaks them, and they happen. Which did he create first? Light or the sun? Which did he create first? Think about that, take that in your notes. Light or the sun? It will become important later on. So now he's made lights and seasons. He's filled the heavens with what he created. He made 2 great lights, and God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. Day 2, he creates space-time, forms the heavens, whichever way you wish to call it. Excuse me. Day 3, I missed something here in my notes, but anyway, day 3, he forms we'll skip to day 3. Day 3, he forms the land and fills it with plants. But then also in day 6, he fills the land and gives it purpose. Look at day 6, chapter 1, verse 24. "And God said, Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." He created the dry land, and now he fills it with living creatures. Again, the pattern is forming and filling it. He filled it with plants. Later on, he fills it with creatures. And then we get to day 6. As the capstone of God's creation, he creates man, God's representative on earth. God said in verse 26, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In an image of God created he him, male and female. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply," and do what? Fill the earth. Even God's capstone creation was to continue to grow and to fill. But in this particular case, we have a secondary account that gives us more detail. So let's jump over to Genesis 2, verse 7. Genesis 2, verse 7. Here we get to the details of the creation of man, and we get a little bit more information. But the pattern remains the same. In Genesis, we could be forgiven if we thought God just spoke man into existence like he did everything else. But Genesis chapter 2 shows us the actual details. Not that they contradict each other, but rather one is an overview, and then the second one fills in the case of the details. Genesis 2, verse 7. "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature." Now, how is this different from other parts of God's creation? How is this different? Individual attention. When God created the animals, he said, "Let's have some animals." And poof, they're animals. Okay? Here he gives individual attention. He says, "I'm going to form this thing in particular." When God created the universe, he made it from nothing. When God created man, he created man from something that already existed, something he had previously created. So there are some differences here. But still, he gets down, uses the dust of the ground, forms the man, and then what does he do with him? He breathes into him. He fills him with life. He forms and fills. He breathes into him the breath of life, just like he breathes into us the Holy Spirit and fills us with the Holy Spirit, just like Adam. Now, you may have noticed that I skipped a few verses aside from the ones I missed on day 3 there, or day 2 there, sorry. But I want to go back and take a look at something important about the filling. Let's go back to Genesis 1, verse 11. Genesis 1, verse 11. We've talked about God's process of creating by calling something out, separating it. That's how he forms it and names it. And then the next step, he fills it. But he doesn't just fill it with stuff. Okay? It's not just that kind of filling. He says in Genesis 1, verse 11, and he says this similar language on the other days as well, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth, and it was so. In verse 22, God does the same thing with the animals, with the other living creatures, and he says to them, be fruitful and multiply. God creates things with capacities to procreate, capacities to continue. God did not, for example, create all the apples that would ever exist in the universe at one point in time. Imagine if he'd have done that. We'd have run out of apple pie thousands of years ago. Or we'd be swimming in apples still, depending on how many he created. No, he creates things with capacities. Plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, animals and people, he tells them to be fruitful and multiply. God made a world charged with creative capacity. He intentionally creates, his intentionality forms and fills with the idea of further fruit. He intentionally forms and fills things with the idea that they will produce further fruit. Genesis 1:20 repeats this. Let the waters swarm with living creatures and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. This is not a tiny, every once in a while something gets born. This is swarming. This is flying. This is filling. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the waters and the sea. Let birds multiply on the earth. He tells man, be fruitful and multiply and have dominion. There is a purpose for the filling. It's not just in and of itself, it is purposeful. Now, I told you we were going to talk about philosophy a little bit, and this is one point where we're going to do that, because this reality helps us avoid a couple mistakes in our thinking if we are philosophically minded. Number one, the pagan view of perfection. I'll call it pagan. It's the Greco-Roman view, the Platonic view of perfection. Make it perfection with a capital P so you're talking about a universal idea. Imagine if something is absolutely perfect. Don't care what it is, okay? Just the idea of perfect. If it ever changes, what does that mean? It becomes imperfect. Because if it's already perfect, it can't change unless it deteriorates and becomes imperfect. So if something is perfect in that philosophical sense, it is static. It never moves. It never grows. It never changes. God isn't like that. God didn't create a world like that. That's not what we mean when we say God is perfect, okay? That's not the idea of perfection. We need to take that concept, and if someone throws that at us and says, well, if God's perfect according to the Greeks, yada, yada, no, that is not the biblical conception of what God is. That is a false conception placed upon by other people. He didn't make a perfect world and then tell everyone to keep it as it is. Being holy is not the same thing as holding still, being afraid to move, being static. Notice the first blessing in the Bible. God created a good world and blessed the animals by calling them to move, to be fruitful, to multiply. They had a purpose. They were to go on and do something. They were not supposed to stay static. So that concept of perfection we need to set aside because it is not a biblical concept. Even from the very beginning, God's plan for his good creation was that people miss this truth. They get tricked into a false perception that sets up God against the creation as competitors or enemies. How does this impact our thoughts and behavior? Well, what about when something happens to us through natural circumstances? Natural circumstances. How do we react to that? How do we think about that? If we work hard and we get a lot of money and we do well in our business, those are natural circumstances because of the laws of economics, and if you work hard and you progress and then things grow. How do we react? If we know God that created a universe that has natural circumstances, we need to remember that those circumstances are part of God's will too. Did you succeed through hard work? And is that a natural result? Great. Wonderful. Give thanks to God for creating a world that has natural results, that you and I can take advantage of them. A second mistake that this erases is what's frequently referred to when attacking Christians about their view on creation versus evolution, and that is the theory of the God of the gaps, which is simply that we don't know how to explain this, therefore God must have done it. Okay? Now, the first counter to that, if you're ever in that situation, is there's also this thing called science of the gaps. We don't know how to explain this, but we know we eventually will. Wait a second. No, you don't know how to explain it. You don't know how to explain it. You don't know if you eventually will. So it works both ways. There's God of the gaps and science of the gaps. But anyway, this theory tells us that back in our naive past, when people didn't understand the world, they attributed the unexplained, the gaps, to God. So this is what this is all about. This theory suggests that God was a useful tool to explain the world way back then when we were all goat herders. But now we've discovered explanations through scientific inquiry. And this is not to slight scientific inquiry. We're going to see in a few minutes some incredible stuff from that side. But again, the Bible teaches a very different story. Genesis 1 teaches that from the beginning, God created the world with capacities, and those capacities, working and functioning, should not take our attention away from God. Instead, they should cause us to praise Him because their work follows His design and His decree. God wanted creation to have processes in it. He wanted apples to make more apples. He wanted birds to make more birds. He wanted people to make more people. He charged the world to work in these ways. God's plan for His good world has always included the good work of growth and change. And it includes that is true for us as well, and us humans. He gave us creativity. Think of the beautiful sculptures that have been created through time, the paintings, the music, all of that sort of thing. And it's true for us as Christians as well. He formed us and filled us for the purpose of growth and change as Christians. We see that specifically in Genesis 2, verse 15. Genesis 2, verse 15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden. Why? He gave him a job. God gave him a job. He said to dress it and keep it, to work it and keep it, to make it produce the best that it can for its whatever it is, the best apple for apple trees, the best robins for robins, etc., etc. God gave man a purpose. We are not static. So let's do a little bit of a summary here. What does Genesis chapters 1 and 2 mean? What is its purpose? Well, first of all, the purpose is about who did it. Who did it? This is the power of the God you're now going to worship, God said. There is a purpose. God forms and then He fills. He's telling people there's a purpose for the creation. It was personal. God's choice, a personal choice by a personal God, who then spent personal time making people. Although there are scientifically true concepts here, we will get into those in just a minute. It is not a description of how the creation was made. It's not a construction schedule, and to read it that way is to read it other than how it was intended. Now, I also said along the way we'd answer some questions and show how creation impacts many other things. Creation and philosophy. Now, we've talked about the idea of perfection, so we've got that one here as well. Creation account teaches there is order in the universe, that the universe can be understood. That's the philosophical framework for all science. If you did not think you could understand it, you wouldn't be out measuring it, trying to understand it. So before you can do science, you have to do philosophy. That's just the bare truth. We talked about the concept of perfection. What is perfection? The Greek concept does not exist, okay? Also tells us that God is personal, intentional, loving, and powerful. Now, this is one that trips people up because that means that there's purpose and responsibility for us as his creation as well. If God is personal, intentional, loving, and powerful, that means he did this for a reason, and it's up to us to find that reason. That's one of the things science tries to avoid. Also, we go back to perfection here just for a minute. There was a branch of aberrant Christianity called Gnosticism. It's died out in the past, although its ideas are still flitting around the world. They took this idea of perfection, and that was sort of the core of Gnosticism, because Gnosticism says, well, there was this God up here, and then sort of like as heat radiates from a fire, you get a little further away from it, and it's not so warm. Well, that's Jesus. And then you get a little further away from that, and it's not so warm. Well, those are the angels. And you get a little further away from that, it's not so. Well, that's humanity. And you finally get over here to earth. And some Gnostics believe the earth was created by an evil being, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole idea of what's called emanations, which to them meant there's only one God, and Jesus Christ could not be God. He had to be sort of not quite as powerful. Okay, that all goes away with the when we kill off the concept of that perfection that cannot change. So that's a little bit on philosophy. What about observation? What about those who say the ancients came up with this creation idea by observing things around them and saying, okay, this is how it happened? Well, let's ask some questions. They observed, you can tell by observing that the world does have patterns. You can see that seasons repeat themselves, that animals produce like animals, that trees produce like trees. Okay, there are patterns. There's also a certain amount of chaos in the world. Think about the oceans. They're chaotic. Their form is always changing. Okay? But what about, remember I asked you what he created first? What about the sun and the light? Think about it. You're herding goats in the Sinai Peninsula, and you're trying to figure out how everything got to be. And, well, where does light come from? You're in the desert. Where does light come from? It comes from the sun, obviously. So if you were going to invent a creation story because you were bored, because goat herding is rather dull and tedious, and you're a thinker and you want to rise above that, which would you put first? You wouldn't put light and then the sun. You would put the sun first and then light. In fact, most creation myths do exactly that. Most myths invented by human beings do exactly that. They put those things in that order. Secondly, in this creation account, what is the perspective? What is it, an earth-based perspective, or is it a perspective from somewhere else? God's saying this and it happens down here. God says this and it happens down here. It's all from the perspective of God in heaven, or at least the first part of it is. So that wouldn't be what you would be thinking about if you were making this up as you go along from an earthly perspective. So no, this is not an account that was derived purely from observation. There are some things that are observable in it. Yes, there are. But there are also some things that are not observable. One of the other objections moderns have to this account is they say it's just a copy like all the other creation myths. How many of you have heard that before? Okay, a few of you. Great. Well, there are some similarities. Other myths have order coming from chaos. This is true, and that's part of what this account is about. How did order get into the world? But the other myths, particularly the Mesopotamian ones, and also the Egyptian ones, and many others, that order comes through might and battle and destruction and fighting, because one of the gods is more powerful than the forces of chaos. I'm thinking of the Babylonian creation myth, where there's this horrible creature called Tiamat, and all the gods are afraid of Tiamat. What are we going to do about Tiamat? And one of the gods, named Marduk, stands up and says, well, if you make me king, I'll go kill her. And notice that Tiamat's female. So it tells you something about the people who invented this as well. So they say, okay, go kill her, we'll make you king. So Marduk does that. He goes and he fights and he kills Tiamat and he becomes king of the gods. Okay? So that's their creation account. Might and force and power. We don't see that in the creation account in Genesis. God doesn't destroy things and burn things up to make stuff. He just makes it. It's done with intention. It's done with love. It's done with concern. In other myths, creation always seems to be from something else. In the Babylonian myth, he takes Tiamat's body, cuts her up, and does all kinds of things with it, and that's how the universe is created. And as sort of an afterthought, some of the blood falls on the ground, and poof, people jump up out of the ground. Okay? So humans, mankind is an afterthought. But in the Bible, creation is from nothing. It's not from previously existing matter, except for humankind. God is so powerful, he doesn't have to fight anything. He just speaks and it happens. He just says it and it happens. Man represents God on the earth. He's not a laborer for the gods. It is done with intention. It's not just by accident, not just some drops of blood spilling on the sand. There's no violence or use of force. This is not a copy from another work. It may be a different perspective on the same event, but it's not a linear copy from other stuff. There's too much that's different. Well, what about modern science? We've talked about the ancients, we've talked about observation, we've talked about what's in the Genesis account. What about modern science? Doesn't that say something about the origins of the universe? And most importantly, does it replace the creation account? So, here goes. This is the part that I find super cool. This is what science says. You see the picture up there. At one point, there was nothing. Then all of a sudden, there's a bunch of something. Okay, it's called the Big Bang. And that something goes through this process. There's nothing down here at this end, and then it starts expanding, and it goes through what's called a quantum state. Now, how many of you have studied quantum physics? Okay, I haven't either really, but I've dabbled in it, and it's incredible. I'm going to be oversimplifying. Let me warn you, first of all, I'm oversimplifying, but I have checked my oversimplification with actual physicists, and they say, oh yeah, that's decent. I mean, for you. Okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. So anyway, we live in what's called the Newtonian realm, or the Newtonian world. What does that mean? The laws of Newton apply. Gravity is gravity. Velocity is velocity. Acceleration is acceleration. I know that this is going to be here. If I turn my back on it and turn back around, it's still going to be here. The Newtonian world is like that. Guess what? There's a whole nother realm out there where those rules do not apply. It's called the quantum, or the quantum realm, if you will. Let me give you an example how strange this is. There's a thing called quantum entanglement. When this is cutting edge physics at the moment. In fact, there was just a recent experiment done to verify that this actually exists. Quantum entanglement. You take two particles, I don't care what they are. They can be two elephants, they can be two single particles, I don't care what they are. I don't know how they get quantumly entangled. I have no idea. But apparently, once they are quantumly entangled, I don't care where you put them in the universe. One could be on Earth and the other could be halfway across the universe. If you smash one with a hammer, at the same instant, the other one's going to get smashed with a hammer. I have no idea how that works, but apparently it does, and it's measurable. That doesn't work in the Newtonian world. If I smash my thumb here, there's nobody in Russia going, ow, I smashed my thumb. It doesn't happen that way. That's one of the differences. There are a couple fundamental rules, at least as far as we know, about the quantum. And one of them is this. Everything is either a wave or a particle. It's either a wave or a particle. Now, the question is, how does something move from the quantum to the Newtonian? Because all matter exists and comes and goes apparently between these two. How does it move from one to the other? Well, remember I told you there's another word we use when we're talking about separate. What was that word? Measurement. That's how things move from quantum to the Newtonian world. If you take a particle in the quantum and you measure it with a wave measuring device, it becomes a wave in the Newtonian world. If you measure with a particle measuring device, it becomes a particle in the Newtonian world. How did God take stuff from tohu and bohu and to move it into, here's what we're doing, we can touch it? He measured. He separated. He said the waters are here and here. The heavens are here and here. This sounds a lot similar to me. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. It sounds similar. So, you'll also notice, well, we'll get back to that. Let's superimpose the creation, the biblical creation account, on this model of the Big Bang. First of all, we know there was nothing. God said there's nothing, and he said, let's create something, and poof, it happened, okay? Suddenly. Then, everything's in the quantum. Everything's tohu and bohu. The rules don't apply. It's confusion. It's formless. And then God starts to measure, and things start coming into the world. And what is the first thing he does? He says, let there be light. What was the first thing, according to science, in the universe, and may underlie everything in the universe? It was light, long before the sun ever existed. Light. How did goat herders in the Sinai Peninsula know that light existed before the sun? We didn't discover that until a few years ago, 1960s, roughly, in science, okay? How did they know that? They didn't know that. They wouldn't be able to observe that. That's something that God used a very ingenious way to communicate to them. Now, of course, they didn't understand that that wasn't the main reason he was saying that. That wasn't what he was trying to communicate. But the point is, a very simple, clear, easily to understood creation account holds within it some incredibly complex physics that were not understood until just recently in our own day and age. Okay, and then how does the stuff become stuff? By measurement. Setting boundaries, separating the heavens from the heavens, the waters from the waters, the earth from the waters, the light from day and night and day. There we go. Light and darkness. How does something move from the quantum? We measure it. All right. We've only got one other thing we need to talk about, because the Big Bang says, or modern, you can't see it here, it got cut off on the slide, the modern interpretation of the arrival of the universe says it was about 13 billion years ago. 13 billion, some people say 15 billion. Let's not quibble over a billion here and there, okay? Let's talk about that. This is one of my favorite friends right here, introducing the time dilation of gravity, the concept of the time dilation of gravity. And this is the thing that really made me begin to believe more that there's some incredible truth that's, like I said, sort of hidden in Genesis. There's some very advanced physics stuff in there that God wasn't trying to communicate advanced physics. He was just telling him what happened, and it's there. The time dilation of gravity. Did you know that time is not static? Okay, and there's a formula. The closer you get to the speed of light, the slower time goes. Okay? And this is measurable. This isn't just a theory. They've done experiments and it comes up the same, right? And this is the formula right here in the background on the green. For those of you who like those kind of formulas, you can try it out if you want to. Anyway, the Big Bang says that before everything exploded, everything was concentrated, all matter, all energies, all space-time was concentrated into a point the size of a period on the on a page. It didn't exist. It was compacted. As you compact all that matter, it speeds up. It gets faster and faster. All molecules get faster. And as they get closer and closer to the speed of light, time slows down at this end. Okay? I think you see where I might be going with this. Time slows down at this end. So, again, this is measurable. It's not just a theory. It does happen. So what about the age? What about the age? Remember, down here at this end, time is moving at a different rate. This is us over here. This is us over here. Time's moving at a different speed over there. What is the difference? That's us, our perspective. We see the universe. We measure time in a certain way. That's God over there. He's seeing the universe. He measures time a different way. We can calculate how this works. Why didn't my slide change? There we go. From our point of view, 13 billion years. You take that 13 billion years and you run it through that formula I showed you, and guess what shows up on the other end? 6.5 days. 6.5 days. Now, this is not 6.5 symbolic days, okay? This is 6.5 literal days, meaning it is possible that the universe could be 13 billion years old and created in 6 days all at the same time. Because both are literally true. It just depends on which clock you're looking at, from which point of view. I find that coincidence intriguing, and I'm not saying you have to believe it or anything like that, okay? I just find that intriguing. That we get that close to the creation account through science. And again, they're not sort of symbolic days. They would be 6.5 literal days. So let's recap a little bit. Sorry, we've been a bit fragmented here maybe. Science, does it say there was a beginning? Yes. Does creation say there was a beginning? Yes. And guess what? Creation said it long before science did. Science didn't believe the universe had a beginning until 1968. That was when the Big Bang Theory got accepted. Previously, everyone said the universe has always existed. Science tells us light was created first. Creation says light was created first. Science talks about the quantum. I think creation talks about the quantum as well, tohu and bohu. Measurement as a means of getting things from the quantum to the Newtonian. Yes and yes. The age, science says 13 billion years. Creation, you can put your number on it however you wish, okay? I'm not going to sit up here and dictate how, if you want to believe 6,000 years, you want to believe 13 billion, you want to, somewhere in between, that is fine with me. Purpose. Science has no answer for the purpose of the universe. It just says that it exists. Creation does have an answer. And science is also silent on who, because those are not scientific questions. Okay, they're not questions you can measure. If somebody does some graffiti tagging on a wall, you can't measure the tagging. Well, okay, I guess you probably could, but you know what I mean. Okay, my analogy is going to fall apart. You can't measure the tagging and decide who did it. Okay, you have to find out who did it before you know who did it. The science of it can't. The evaporation rate of the paint won't tell you that, for example. All right, so let me wrap up finality. Sorry, I'm not going to go there quite yet. The purpose of Genesis 1 and 2 is not about the process. It's giving the children of Israel confidence in the power of God, who did not have to fight to make the world. He was so strong, he spoke it into existence. He separated and named his people the same way he separated and named his creation. Their existence was as sure, therefore, as the ground they walked on. That's the message of Genesis 1 and 2. However, in detailing this truth, God also did some wonderful things. He revealed complicated scientific facts in a manner that is understandable. In so doing, he provided proof that there is no way the creation account was derived from observation by primitive or not so primitive people. And there is a similar pattern for us. He formed us in his likeness. He forms us to the pattern of Jesus, fills us with the Spirit, and expects us to fulfill our purpose as well. We are not formless. We are not void either. So, in conclusion, if God If God can create the universe out of nothing, imagine what he can make out of you and me. If God can bring order out of chaos, imagine what he can bring to your life. If God set the boundaries of the universe, should we obey the boundaries he sets on us? If God allowed for diversity, not just allowed for it, but programmed it into the very nature of nature, how should we approach our surroundings and people around us? If God cared enough to make man personally, how much does he care for you, and how much should we care about other people? And finally, God said it was good. Not perfect. He said it was good, meaning it was to continue to grow and to change. If God did that, he created processes as much as a result as he did results. What is your trajectory? And that, dear friends, is the importance and the reality of God as the creator.